right, so good morning, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. If you're joining us for the first time, and I know we do have a bunch of people joining us for the first time today, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And today is particularly exciting because it continues a series we started just 2 short weeks ago with the Gairdner Foundation. So the Gairdner Foundation is based in Toronto, and they celebrate the world pioneers and leaders in global health and biomedical research. We've covered COVID and vaccines. We've gone to learn about CRISPR, and today we're going to dive in with a very unique and different topic, the first time we've ever covered mental health here at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. So we're joined live near Boston by Dr. Vikram Patel, and he is a Harvard researcher and one of the pioneers in mental health research and clinical applications around the world. Mental health is something that when I was a kid wasn't talked about, and when it was stigmatized, and that is quickly changing on a world scale. It's something that we talk about in our offices, we talk about in our families, and that is getting a lot of recognition and support around the world. And Dr. Patel is no small part of the reason why that is happening. So I'm really thrilled to bring him in today. Before I do, I just want to note 2 quick housekeeping notes. For one, Gairdner Foundation, as I said, do check them out. We're going to be highlighting this throughout the broadcast and throughout the series. And secondly, we are going to have some polls today. So if you're on YouTube or in your class right now, go to slido.com with the event code HEALTH. We're going to have 4 questions for you guys today. And whether as individual students or as classrooms, you can take part in this. We'd love to hear your answers, and we'll announce all the results after each question is done. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Patel. Thank you so much for joining us today. And please demute your mic, come on in and take us away.
Hi, thank you so much, Jesse. And thank you all, whoever's joined in. I can't unfortunately see you. This would have been so much more fun if we were in the same room, but we all know why we're not in the same room. I'm going to be actually spending the next hour interacting with you. I don't have any slides, and I'm going to be actually asking you certain questions. So I really hope that, as Jesse said, that you have been able to access the site on slido.com and you've entered the event code. So over the course of the next hour, there's going to be 4 different questions I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to use that as a basis for us to have a conversation. But of course, one of the reasons you hopefully signed on today isn't just simply because you want to hear about the topic, but also you want to hear about the latest science in that topic. And what I'm going to try to do is to really distill the science. So this has been an area of my work for the last 25 years. That's to say, the mental health of young people just like yourselves. And so what I'm going to try and do is distill that science so that in a way that it's engaging, it's helpful, it's meaningful, particularly at times like this, which I know we'll talk about in a moment, have been extraordinary and for many of us extremely stressful. So I'm going to start by actually, let's see how this works, because it turns out that the polls are actually not part of this particular, the window that I'm speaking to, but it's a separate window that you're going to have to access. What Jesse's going to do is, when I ask him to pull up the poll, the first question is going to appear on your screens, on the other screen, the other window. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds or up to a minute for all of you to complete your answer, and then we're going to kickstart our discussion immediately after that. So I'm going to ask Jesse to test this out. And Jesse, could you pull up the first question?
I've pulled up our first question. So everyone, again, if you're new to this, we haven't used Slido in some time. So slido.com, event code health. I know it's kind of awkward, but I'd love if you guys would head there. We've already got, wow, you guys are surpassing my wildest expectations. We've got tons of answers pouring in, 20 of you already. So keep sharing your answers there. We've got our first question up on Slido. So please do share whatever your thoughts are. 30 answers now. This is great, guys. We're going to give you 15 more seconds, so keep typing in those answers. And I'm so glad you guys are all acquainted with the tech and are ready for the rest of our questions. So our first question results are up. If you'd like, Dr. Patel, I can bring up what the question is on the screen in a banner so that everyone can see it from at home, and then I can share our answers with you. Does that work?
Please, Jesse, that'd be great. And do that for all the other questions that follow as well.
Perfect. All right. So we have 44 respondees coming in for our first question. Our first question was this on the bottom. When you hear the word mental health, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? And so we had a bunch of answers that people could share on that, which are all the ones below. So with our 48 answers, a medical issue was our number 1 result picked. 35% of our respondees said a medical issue. An additional 30% said suffering. Feeling good about myself was the next highest. And then something else or insanity rounded out the top answers, I guess, or all the answers. Insanity was the lowest at just 4% with our 50 respondees. So that's not.
Thanks, Jesse. Well, first of all, thank you. That was terrific. That worked incredibly well. So much for the supreme technology that Jesse set up for us. So thank you, Jesse. Look, that's amazing. So roughly, I would calculate that's about 2/3 of you have chosen a medical issue or suffering. And I'm not surprised. Because let's be honest, when you hear the word mental health, this is what most people think of first. It's not health, it's about sickness. But actually, I think we really do need to reimagine what the word mental health really is. Let me start with the definition that the World Health Organization gives for mental health. The WHO defines mental health as follows. It is a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the stresses, the normal stresses of everyday life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. That is an incredibly broad definition. And if you think about all of those words, what is remarkable is that there is no word indicating sickness, suffering, or medicine. In fact, that definition of mental health suggests that it is actually the single most important aspect of my being, because it defines the way I feel, the way I think, the way I solve problems, the way I perceive the world around me, and the way I behave every single moment of my life, both with myself and others around me. This is an amazingly broad definition, and it is quite different and much more, much bigger, infinitely bigger than the idea that this is a medical problem or it is equivalent to suffering. When I was your age, I would think of my mental health as including the way I felt when I woke up in the morning. Did I really look forward to going to school? Did I really look forward to meeting my friends? And when I got to school, how able was I to concentrate on my studies? How much fun did I have with my friends? How well did I feel when I completed a game of sports? And when I got home in the evening, what happened at home? How well did I get on with my parents, my brothers and sisters? How well did I sleep at night? It was the story of my day and indeed the story of my life. What modern science tells us is a couple of really important things that I want to really kickstart our conversation with. First of all, that the influences on our mental health, each and every one of our mental health, is extremely unique and personal, and is accounted for by three very distinct sets of factors. The first, of course, is our genes, which we inherit from our parents. And I like to think of our genes really as setting, as it were, the canvas, the frame of the canvas of our lives. That is really, as it were, the outer limit of our mental health. But the canvas itself is pretty blank. The painting that defines our lives begins from the very earliest days of our life. And indeed, that's the second set of factors that influence our mental health, our early life experiences. And this is a very important reason why children who've had difficult early lives are much more at risk to develop mental health problems later in life. And then the third set of factors, it's what's happening to us right now. And so if you think of these three sets of factors, our genes, our early life experiences, and what's happening to us right now, you'll quickly see that this set of factors is incredibly unique to an individual's life. And in other words, therefore, mental health is not about boxing ourselves into different diseases and diagnoses, but in fact, it's about the unique stories that each of us has had in our lives. In many ways, I say we have 7 billion plus stories of mental health on our planet. But of course, across these extremely diverse and unique stories that define each of us, we also have some universal truths which tell us a great deal about mental health. And that brings me to the second very important scientific fact that I want to leave you with. And this is that we cannot think of mental health purely as a medical issue. And let me explain what I mean by that. Let's consider, for example, the incredible public health crisis that we're all facing right now. That crisis has been precipitated by a virus, the coronavirus. In a medical sense, it is possible for us to classify everyone in the world into two buckets. Either you have the virus or have it right now, or you don't have the virus. Those who have the virus have the disease, and those who don't have the virus are free from the disease. But we can't really think about mental health in that kind of binary way, because neuroscience has taught us that our mental health, which comprises a complex set of human traits, for example, our memory, our mood, the way we see the future, the ability that we have to solve problems, these are incredibly complex human traits, and it isn't a binary that defines people with or without that trait, but it's a dimension. And that dimension extends from wellness, the state that we all want to be all the time, to distress, when we're upset a little bit by something that's happened to us, but a state from which most of us will bounce back to wellness again. And at the other end of the extreme of the dimension, the frank illness. And how do we distinguish frank illness or mental health problems, what some of you call a medical problem or suffering, from distress or wellness? Well, there isn't a hard line in the sand. There isn't a test that can help us distinguish those who have a mental health problem from those who are simply going through a difficult day. For example, with COVID-19, we can do a blood test, or we can do a swab, and we can determine, using one of these, whether a person has had an infection in the past or is currently infected. There is no such test for any mental health problem. So instead, what we rely on is three different characteristics of the experience of mental ill health that help us distinguish who might need professional help. The first is how intense is this distress. Typically, by that it means how many different aspects of our mental health is affected. Is it the case that it's just that I can't sleep well at night, or is it also that I can't sleep well at night, plus I'm feeling constantly on edge, losing my temper all the time, and I can't concentrate at all on my studies? The latter is a much more intense experience than simply not being able to sleep at night. The second criterion that we use is how long has this been going on for? And it's a complete arbitrary rule, but basically we say if you've been having these intense problems for most of the day for at least 2 weeks, that's potentially a health problem. It's pretty arbitrary. You might argue, why not 3 weeks? Well, there isn't really any good explanation for that. We just think that 2 weeks is long enough to allow distress states to bounce back to normal. And if you don't bounce back, well, you should seek help. And the third is how much does this distress interfere with your daily life? And by daily life, at your age, that would include, for example, it interfering with your education, interfering with the friendships that you have with people around you, interfering with your relationships at home. So, two very important pieces of science which I've tried to simplify and distill. First is that mental health isn't a binary state, but in fact it's a dimension. And each of us at every point in our lives is somewhere on that dimension. All of us are striving to go to the wellness end of that dimension. The second is that our mental health is determined by a complex interaction of our genes, early life experiences, and what's going on in our life right now. And in that sense, our mental health is a very unique characteristic that only applies to us because these three sets of factors are so unique. All right, let me now turn to the next part of my talk, is why mental health problems are important for young people of your age. Now is the time, Jesse, for you to do that magic and pull up the second question. Jesse, over to you.
I think you're doing all the magic, Dr. Patel, but I will certainly bring out the poll. So for everyone who's tuning in again, slido.com, event code health. We've got our second question up. Response is already pouring in, which is fantastic. So I'm going to give you another 30 seconds for that. While we're waiting for your answers too, I want to note, because this is always of interest to our classes, Dr. Patel has done a TED Talk as well. So when you're done this presentation, it's going to be covering some of the same ground, but it's a fascinating sort of journey into a lot of really cool research. If you want to follow up with that, I will share the link with that with our classes after the fact as well. 36 of you have already responded. I'm going to give you guys another 10 seconds. So while we're doing that, I'm going to bring up the question that we have and the possible answers on the screen here for us. So our question that we have right now is, do you know anyone in your close circle of friends who is struggling with their mental health? Yes, no, or not sure. So certainly for myself personally, I know a few people who are struggling with mental health lately. You mentioned the impact of the pandemic, and several people I know are struggling quite a bit with that, with the loneliness associated with that, some of those other things. So let's see what our answers are. 53 answers. Thank you so much for everyone on Slido. You guys are doing great. So with our 53 responses, 60% say yes, 30% say not sure, and I find this really interesting personally. Only 9% say no. So we've got massive yes, quite a few not sure, and then a 10% or so is no.
Well, thank you, Jesse. And again, thank you to every one of you who completed that poll. This is a tough question. And let me interpret this question in my own way, which is that 90% of you know someone who has struggled with their mental health or think that someone has. Not sure to me is, well, you can never be 100% sure sometimes. The 60% who said yes, they're sure. The other 30% are concerned or worried that somebody in their inner close circle of friends has been struggling with their mental health. That tells you why mental health is so important to young people. Indeed, 100% of young people will experience mental health distress at some point in their life, because actually it's pretty normal. You know, I mean, bad things happen to all of us at some point in our lives, and feeling miserable, angry, frustrated, fearful, anxious, wanting even sometimes to harm oneself, using drugs or alcohol to relax, dieting unhealthily, and sometimes even more distressing experiences are very common in the population. And this is the third important scientific fact I want to bring to you. This particular science is called epidemiology, and what it is doing really is surveying large sections of the population, samples drawn from the population, for example, college students, and asking them questions about their mental health using survey tools. And based on that, we now know that anywhere from 40 to 80% of adolescents will, at a given point in time, admit to feeling at least one or more of these distressing experiences. By the way, this doesn't mean that they have a mental illness. Remember the dimension. This is distress. It's very common. And the vast majority of those who are experiencing this distress will bounce back, simply because that's the way our minds are. They're built, they're engineered in ways that help us cope with the stressors, the uncertainties that create the distress, and we figure out ways to actually bounce back. And don't worry, I'm going to talk about the bouncing back a little later in my talk. Indeed, this is the most important characteristic of mental health distress. The vast majority of people will recover through simple things that they're doing, oftentimes simply by intuition. But it is also important to remember that a few of us don't go back to the wellness end of the dimension. And instead, that distress continues to persist, becomes more intense, lasts for more than 2 weeks, and it begins to interfere with our daily lives. This might surprise you to learn that epidemiology has taught us that nearly 75% of all mental illnesses in the population have their origins before the age of 24. And that in adolescence, the single most important cause of sickness is a mental illness. And in most parts of the world, suicide is the leading cause of death in adolescence. So it is very clear that even though most adolescents with mental health distress will pull back, that youth is the phase of life when mental health is most threatened. And that's really an important observation. What's even more worrying is that it seems that mental health problems in adolescence are becoming more common. Now, I guess a very important question that's burning in your mind is why? Why now? Why during my adolescence? And here again, I'm going to turn to science. And here I'm going to draw on quite different strands of science. And this is the wonderful thing about mental health, is that there is no one scientific discipline that really helps us understand mental health. I've already invoked neuroscience, I've invoked epidemiology and public health. And I'm going to go back to neuroscience now, first, to understand why young people are at the highest risk age group for developing mental health problems. It's because the brain is undergoing very dramatic changes during the period just after puberty and lasting all the way into your mid-20s. And what is that change? The change is actually that the different parts of your brain mature at different times. You might be scratching your heads and thinking, that's pretty opaque and abstract. What the hell does that mean? Let me explain. Our brain, especially the cerebral cortex, which is where our mental health, our consciousness actually resides, has many different parts to it. And there's one part called the limbic cortex that's deep inside our brain. And this is the part of the brain that mediates what neuroscientists call, and I'm not making this up, they call it hot emotions. Now you can figure out what they mean by hot emotions, right? Rage, lust, thrill-seeking. That all is going on in the limbic cortex, and that part of the brain is maturing, when you're about 12 or 13 or 14. But the part of the brain immediately behind the forehead, the prefrontal cortex, the biggest part of the cerebral cortex is actually the prefrontal cortex, that matures only by the age of 20 or 22. Why is that important? Because it is the prefrontal cortex that actually tells you to stop and think before you act. Do you remember the cartoons? I don't know if you guys used to see these cartoons, but when I was a kid, we used to have these cartoons, these Disney cartoons, for example, that used to have this, this character who would be, thinking about whether or not to do something really risky. And there'd be a demon on one side and an angel on the other. And the angel would be saying, don't do it, don't do it. And the demon would be saying, oh my goodness, come on, if you don't do it now, when will you ever know what fun is like? Well, this is what adolescence is. Risk-taking is an evolutionary characteristic that applies across all mammalian species, including the human species. And because the prefrontal cortex only matures in young adulthood, during this phase of life is the phase in which we are almost biologically primed to take risks. And this risk-taking, by the way, is extremely important in order for us to make that transition from childhood to adulthood. Childhood, when we are totally dependent on our parents for every need, to adulthood, when we have become totally autonomous. If we don't take risks now and learn from the mistakes that we make, we will never be efficient and survive as adults. It's an evolutionary drive. So that's one reason, that's neuroscience. The second reason is psychosocial. Mainly from the social sciences, we now know that this is the phase of life in which we make the biggest transitions, and I already alluded to that. What are those transitions? Well, first of all, we complete our education. We've got to find a job. We've got to find someone we love. And in some instances, we're going to have to settle down with them. These are amazing transitions. But the most important transition of all is we're moving from being totally dependent to being totally independent. At no other phase in life will we as a human being ever encounter so many transitions occurring at exactly the same time and all compressed into a few years of our life. We as neuroscientists and mental health professionals only figured this out about 2 decades ago. But there's one chap who knew about this a long time ago, and I'm gonna wait a few moments for you to think of who I'm referring to. Someone who has entertained every youngster, and indeed a lot of adults, for the last 50 or 70 years. It's Walt Disney. Think about any of Walt Disney's great films. And I'll tell you the ones I love the most, because they're the ones I can think of, is Lion King and Finding Nemo. In both these films, the lead character is a young animal. Simba in The Lion King, and Nemo, of course, in Finding Nemo. And for those of you who have seen the films, you will remember that in both these films, this adolescent, this young lion or fish, is warned by his father not to stray away. In the case of Simba, to the periphery of the savannah because there's his evil uncle who's hanging out there and he's going to get into trouble. Or in the case of Nemo, to swim up to the surface of the ocean because he's going to get into trouble and get caught by fishermen's nets. And of course, what do? They do exactly that. And of course, they get into trouble. The point being that Disney understood that adolescents are primed to take risks because they are seeking thrills. This is an evolutionary characteristic. Of course, unfortunately, they do land up in trouble sometimes, and they particularly land up in trouble when the environment around them, the social environment, actually is creating trouble for them. And this is really where I believe we must take greatest action. Instead of thinking of young people as being biologically primed to get into trouble, we have to think of the environments in which young people are growing up in and think about how can they actually support young people to make the necessary transitions from childhood to adulthood in a way that they don't get into serious trouble. I want to tell you now about 3 very important kinds of influences of our environment that we now know through science, mostly epidemiology, that have demonstrated what those troubling environments can be that can land some of us up into mental health problems. The first is childhood adversity. Childhood adversity is now demonstrated to be what I often refer to as the equivalent of tobacco is to physical health. Childhood adversity is to mental health. And by childhood adversity, I don't only mean the more extreme forms of adversity, such as, for example, suffering abuse and violence, but also more common forms of adversity. For example, growing up in a low-income family in which your parents were very pressed to be working and did not have enough time to spend with you. Childhood neglect and adversity is by far and away the most toxic influence on our mental health. And the reason for this is that our brain is most responsive to environments during the first few years of our life, and that's why adversities in our childhood actually cause lingering effects all the way through into adolescence and adult life. The second toxic environment is in our youth. And this, of course, is a time when the environment shifts from our parents to our peers. And of course, peer environments. When I was a kid, my peer environment was basically my school, the kids in my building. And the worst that could potentially happen to me was, getting into a fight on the sports field. But the peer environment for each of you has transformed. I couldn't even imagine the peer environments that you have, because your peer environment is infinite. Thanks to social media, thanks to the internet, each of you can now acquire friends in inverted commas, really, because for me, a friend was always someone I actually broke bread with. But you can acquire friends from pretty much anywhere in the world, from places you cannot even pinpoint on a map. You can acquire hundreds of friends. The problem with that, of course, there's wonderful things as well, but the problem, because we're talking about mental ill health here, is that it is a natural characteristic of adolescence to compare yourself to your peers. When you were only comparing yourself to your peers in your school or your neighborhood, generally speaking, you were comparing yourself with real people. But now in the social media world, you're comparing yourself with people who might be completely fantasies or fabricating what they're putting on social media. And of course, therefore, the risk of being disappointed, of evaluating yourself in a very negative way are much greater, and you can't really verify any of these comparisons. And the third kind of environment, I talked about home, I talked about school and about your peer environment. And the third kind of environment, of course, is the larger world we live in. And of course, there are many, many issues that concern young people today, not least of which is climate change, racism, inequality in our society, and of course, the elephant in the room of the last 9 months, the pandemic, and all the uncertainties it's brought to our lives, from uncertainties about when will colleges reopen, when will schools reopen, will it be safe to go to schools? And for those of us who are finishing college and entering the job market, goodness me, what will the job market look like? Will I be able to get a job? And so now, thinking about these last surreal, extraordinary months that have just preceded today, I'm going to ask Jesse to pull up the next third question of the poll. Jesse, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Patel. Again, this has been fascinating. And some of the kids have already discovered that on Slido, there's a question and answer element of it too. So again, slido.com, event code health. I look forward to your answers over the next 30 seconds. If students in the classes, if people on YouTube want to start sharing their questions there as well, you can share them on YouTube. We are going to come live and take your questions that way. But if you'd like to share them there, if you'd like to be more anonymous with them, we're already getting some great queries pouring in on Slido. So please do keep sharing those. And worst case, if we can't get to them in the live broadcast, we can share them with Dr. Patel after the fact as well. So I'm going to see where we're going. 32 of you have already responded. That's fantastic. Keep them coming. What I'm going to do too is bring up on the screen our question, which is compared to last year at this time, how has your mental health been in recent months with a 5-point scale from a lot better through to a lot worse? So this is, I mean, you definitely have better insight than I do, but I'm fascinated with the responses coming in so far. It is about even directly down the line, like every single answer is functionally the same amount. It's about 20% for each of them, between a lot better and a lot worse with all the things in between. So there we are. So thank you so much, and take us away.
Oh, thank you, Jesse. And again, thanks to all the people responding. You know what? I am so glad to hear that at least 50% or more of you have felt that your mental health has been either a lot or a bit better or no different. But of course, nearly 50% of you have felt that it's gotten worse as well, which isn't a small proportion. And I would like to start by saying I'm not at all surprised that you have felt, those of you who felt that your mental health has gotten worse, I'm not at all surprised that it happened, because one of the greatest threats to our mental health is uncertainty. It's not knowing what lies ahead. Our minds are trained to help us have control over our destiny, over our future. And right now, each and every one of us, not just you, all of us, adults, kids, everyone is facing an extraordinary situation. And this is the kind of uncertainty that we might experience in almost every time in our life. Consider, for example, the uncertainty of your exam grades, right? I mean, there's an uncertainty there, but that's a one-off uncertainty. You know that by a certain date, that uncertainty will end. Here, uncertainty affects every aspect of our lives and has been going on for months. And just when you thought that things would now return to normal, wham, the uncertainty returns. So if our brains, if our minds are trained to respond to uncertainty with all the symptoms of mental ill health, not at all surprising that at least half of you have been experiencing that mental ill health. Now, I'd love to find out more about how all of you have been coping, but especially I'm really going to hope that we can learn more about those who've been feeling better, a lot better, a little better, what you've been doing. And before I turn to the last poll question, I think it's really important for us to remember that we can learn from each other. My last part of my talk is really going to be the things that each of us can do, what you can do, what I can do to promote our mental health, to make sure that when we're beginning to slide on that dimension from wellness into distress, and from distress a little bit further along the dimension, what we can do to pull ourselves back, pull ourselves towards the wellness dimension. Jesse, on with the very last poll question.
Once more into the breach. So I've opened that up on Slido. If you guys on YouTube or live want to take part, I'd love to hear your answers. More questions pouring in on Slido, which is fantastic. So thank you to all our students for taking part in that way. While we're waiting for our answers to pour in, I just want to note again that this is part of an amazing series with the Gardner Foundation. So check out our 2 other talks last week. They're both on our YouTube channel. It's an incredible series. We're continuing it again through December and into the new year. So hopefully you can join us for more incredible talks. And what I want to do now is bring up our question on our screen for our last poll question today, which is, what do you do personally to cope with difficult thoughts or feelings? So we've already got 28 answers. I'm going to give you guys another 30 seconds or so. And so the answers that we have on our poll on Slido are below. Nothing specific, speak to someone, pray or meditate, do something physical, walk or sports, get stoned, distract myself, example of music, or something else entirely. So I'd love to hear your answers. Please do share. And let's see where we're at, Dr. Patel. 44 respondees. Thank you guys so much. This has been the most consistent throughout a poll program I've ever seen. So distract myself is far and away the #1 answer. 54, and people did have the option to pick multiple options. So 54% of you, distract yourself is your main reason. Do something physical, 43% of you. speak to someone is 30%, and then we've got about 15 to 20% for all the rest of the answers. But distracting yourself, physical, and speak to someone are the main popular answers.
Well, that's terrific, Jesse, and thank you all again. I mean, that was my last poll. You know what? Those of you who said distract yourself, do something physical, and speak to someone, you know exactly what it takes to actually help promote your mental health. So let me tell you what the science tells us. And again, I'm going to simplify the science so that it makes it much easier to access and engage with. There's several things that science shows us. This time, I'm going to be invoking primarily psychological science. Many aspects of psychological science have illuminated what each of us can do to promote our mental health and prevent mental health problems. Let's go each of them in sequence. First, be aware and acknowledge your mental health. Would you watch your leg bleed until it stops? No, you wouldn't, right? You'd immediately do something about it. Treat your mental health with respect. And the same time that you detect that something awry is happening, something's wrong, recognize it so that you can do something about it. It's okay not to be okay. Second, the moment you acknowledge that you have a difficulty with your mental health, do something about it. In the same way as the moment you see your leg bleed, you're going to do something about it, call someone, maybe put a Band-Aid on the wound. Don't just sit around festering with your distress. Who should you speak to? Well, anyone you're comfortable with, because it's okay to talk. Sharing one story about mental health is not only an incredibly powerful way to feel better, we don't understand the physiology of this, but it is proven beyond doubt that just the act of talking greatly reduces anxiety and improves your mood. Most importantly, I want to tell you that it is never a sign of weakness, and on the contrary, it reflects your maturity and comfort with your own feelings. Third, do something physical. Many of you are already doing that. Do something physical. Go for a walk. Go for a swim. Go play sports. I know that right now, some of these activities are not permissible, but you can certainly go for a walk. Even if it's freezing cold out there, wherever you are, you can pad up and go for a walk. And hopefully there are certain kinds of sports that are permissible even at this time. Make sure as part of your physical health that you sleep well, because there's a very profound interconnection between good sleep and poor mental health. So if you don't sleep well, your mental health is going to suffer, and vice versa. And above all, for those of you who said you get stoned in order to make yourself feel better, not a good idea. Not a good idea, because actually there are much healthier ways to actually calm your nerves. And one thing we do know is people who use substances specifically to calm their nerves, that is the highest risk group for developing a dependence on that substance. So it's one thing to use a substance once in a while as a recreation, to have fun, but it's a different thing to use a substance to actually numb yourself when you're suffering. Fourth, think about doing something for others. Now you might think this sounds like, I'm preaching. You might, some of you think, I'm sounding like your local neighborhood priest. But actually, there is a profound body of science that shows that caregiving and community service is not just about charity for others, but actually it is the most important predictor of a long and healthy life. For those of you interested in the science on this, there are many studies, but just when you have time, go to the Harvard University GLUEC study, GLUECK, and you will find a website that describes the longest running study. There's a terrific TED talk as well by the lead investigator of the study. The study's been running for 80 years now, and it followed men for these 80 years and now their children to determine what factors predicted a long and healthy life. And it turns out the relationships, not the number, but their quality, and the ways that these men engage with their community, their schools, their neighborhoods, etc., were the most powerful predictors of a healthy life. And I think we have very good biological mechanisms that help us unpack why that might be the case. Fifth, insulate yourself against the uncertainty by reminding yourself constantly that all of humanity around the world is being buffeted by these turbulent times. And even if some of us might travel in superfast yachts, every one of us will reach the other shore safely. And especially at your age, every single one of you will. I would strongly recommend limiting your engagement with online news, which is often fake and false, and you really can't trust much of it. Stop worrying about the future and focus your mind and thoughts on the now. Feel and enjoy the now and never lose hope. And again, this is very strongly rooted in psychological science, which demonstrates that mindfulness, which is of course focusing on the now, greatly reduces physiological arousal and helps people manage anxiety and stress more effectively. Linked to that is my sixth suggestion, which is meditation. Now, it doesn't really matter what type of meditation you choose. Those of you who have a strong faith might meditate through your faith, for example, through prayer. Others who might be more secular might find alternative traditions of meditation, like, for example, mindfulness that comes from psychology. But what's interesting is that all of them share the same characteristics, and that is the characteristics of focusing one's attention away from the world around us, away from external sensations, and focusing your mind on your breath. Typically what you do is you close your eyes, find a quiet space. What's all that about? It's about reducing the sensory perceptions you get that come into your eyes, in a quiet room, into your ears, so that you can actually more easily focus on your inner sensations. Typically, most meditations focus on your breathing, but some also focus on inner sensations that come from different parts of your body. That is a very powerful technique to reduce physiological arousal. Seventh, many of you said this. Congratulations. Distract yourself. Do something that helps just basically distract your mind away from those troubling, ruminating thoughts that are just going round and round in your head. Distract yourself with some pleasurable activity like music or art or reading. And finally, this is really important. If in spite of all these 7 things, your distress is persistent, it's going on for more than 2 weeks, it's making you feel really, really uncomfortable. For example, you're having repeated thoughts of hurting yourself, or it's coming in the way of getting things done, like, for example, getting on with your studies or fights with friends and family. Seek help from a professional. There is no shame. And it's never been easier to do so thanks to the pandemic. Because thanks to the pandemic, all mental health care has gone digital. It's gone onto telemedicine platforms, so that before you had to walk up to a clinic that says mental health clinic, and you and I know that that's not something any one of us feels comfortable doing. Now you can access a counselor, a psychologist, a social worker, a psychiatrist from the privacy of your bedroom on your own device. It's never been easier. And even if you felt a degree of discomfort doing it before, that discomfort, which is really about people finding out, is no longer going to be coming in your way. So I'm going to end now, and I'm hoping there's going to be there's about 15 minutes for questions. But before I end, I just want to say a few things about our mental health. In caring for our mental health, we not only improve the mental health, our own mental health, but we also improve the mental health of others around us. Because when we are troubled, people around us can pick up signals that we are troubled, and it affects them. And particularly, of course, I'm thinking about our closest friends and family. But equally, the converse is true. In paying attention to the mental health of others around us, we will greatly benefit as well. And so I encourage you, each and every one of you, to be aware of and sensitive to the mental health of those you love, friend circle and at home. Because you will be the person who will first detect that something is amiss. Because you will know what your friend or family member is usually like, and therefore detect when something has changed. Mental health is too important to be left to mental health professionals alone. It's everybody's business. Because as I mentioned to you at the start of my talk, when I gave you the definition of mental health of the World Health Organization, it is the most valued asset we have as human beings. If I had to ask you what's really important to you, is it the color of your hair, or is it the way you think, feel, and interact with one another? I know a few of you will say it's the color of your hair, but the majority of you, I'm absolutely certain, will say it's the way you feel, think, and act. That's a telling signal about what you really value. Take ownership of your mental health as something which is deeply personal, something that needs to be nurtured, protected, looked after like a precious plant. It's something we must value and cherish all the time, and not only become aware of it when we lose it. From a public health perspective, and this is where I'll end, as someone who has worked in the area of mental health science for 25 years, and I really am very passionate about seeing the science being translated into policy. The message I have for governments and for people who are investing in mental health is that the pandemic presents a historic opportunity to reimagine mental health care, to move away from binaries of diseases, doctors, and diagnoses, but instead to scale up the science which demonstrates the need to recognize mental health as a global public good, important to all people, especially young people, and in all countries. Above all, this science emphasizes the need for us to embrace the diversity of experiences and the diversity of ways in which we can promote mental health, prevent mental health problems, and help people recover. Thank you all for being here with me today and for being such great participants in the polls. I believe, Jesse, that we might still have a little bit of time for a Q&A, and I'm all ready to see what the questions are. I hope you're going to have curate the questions for me.
We certainly do, and thank you so much for such a beautiful and very deep and thoughtful talk today. I know for some of our classes, you guys might need to go in the next few minutes, so what I'd love if you do, I'm going to come to all our live groups for some questions, but if you want to type them in the chat bar as well to me to make sure we get them in the next 15 minutes, that would be fantastic. What I want to do is start with Ms. Ball's class. So Ms. Ball's class is joining us in Goderich, Ontario. They're grade 11 and 12s. If any of you have a question that you're willing to share on camera, that would be fantastic. Come on up and go for it.
Anyone have one?
And no worries if not. We've been getting some great questions in Slido, so I can share some of those ones online instead. And I know that it's a very personal topic for a lot of people, so it's something I can do. But Ms. Ball, if not, I can go to our next class. Don't worry.
One of the things I always like to know about is some different jobs in the field. So I wondered if Mr. Patel had sort of a variety of career opportunities in mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a terrific question. I hope that one of the things I was able to convey to everyone is how multidisciplinary the subject of mental health is. There are many different disciplines that you can take to arrive at mental health. So, for example, anthropology and the social sciences are very important for us to understand how communities and people understand their mental health and therefore respond to it. Obviously, psychology, that goes without saying, in many different ways. Psychological science explains how our minds work. Clinical psychology explains how you can address people with mental health problems through psychological therapies. Educational psychology explains how you work with children with learning difficulties and a range of mental health problems in school settings. So psychology itself is a very, very huge discipline. The third is, of course, through medicine. And that's the route I took. And so you medical training, and then you become a psychiatrist. The fourth is neuroscience, and neuroscience itself is extremely diverse, from molecular and cellular neuroscience that is trying to understand circuits in our brain and how different molecules and cells in our brain behave, all the way through to cognitive neuroscience, which is mapping neural circuits and how you interact with the world around us. And it gets even more diverse from there. For example, economics has a relatively new discipline called behavioral economics that helps us understand why we make financial decisions of the kind that we do, and connects our mental health with the economic world that we have to constantly engage with. And that's just a few examples that you can see of very different disciplines, all of which converge on mental health.
Fantastic question. Thank you so much, Ms. Paul. Ms. Fletcher's class, so they're joining us, they're grade 7s, they're coming in from London, the London area in Ontario. If you guys want to share your question live, I will bring you into the broadcast, but I do have it in the chat as well. So what I'll do is bring you in. Oh, hey, Ms. Fletcher, do you want to share your question live on camera?
Sure. So my friend Jamie wants to know, where did it go? What are some not particularly healthy ways to cope with our hardship? Like what things should we be avoiding?
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a very important question. Thank you so much for asking that. So I've already alluded to one thing you shouldn't be doing, right? Which is using substances to help calm your nerves. Simply because that we all at some point in our lives use substances. So this is not about a general blanket rule that I'm talking about, but when you use substances to calm difficult emotions, your brain actually begins to change in the way you relate to that substance. And it becomes harder and harder for the brain to think of the substance as a recreational drug, but instead it sees it almost as medication. And that's something you absolutely do not want to do. The second, of course, thing is to stay quiet. Just sit in your room alone and hope that the thing will lift on its own. If you remember all the things I mentioned earlier, not one of them involves sitting alone and just praying that it goes away. It's one thing to pray in a way that actually brings hope, but it's another thing to pray just to simply say, God, let this thing go away. I would strongly recommend that when you have a distressing emotion, you must never lock yourself in and pray that it just goes away. Instead, you must actually seek help. So that's the second thing that I absolutely would not do.
Yeah.
The third is never think of yourself feeling the emotions that you are letting people down. And the most important person you're letting down is yourself, of course. I am not the person that I thought I would be. Or that you're letting other important people, your parents, for example, or your teachers. The third important thing, therefore, is never, ever to think of distressing experiences as a signal of failure, but simply to see this as your biology, your brain reacting to a particular set of circumstances. Remember, I said there were 3 different factors. You're not even in control of some of them, like your genes. You can't do anything about that, but also you're not in control of what happened to 10 or 15 years ago when you were a kid. So always think of this as a very complex interplay. It's not you who's a failure. It's your health that is in good shape and you need some kind of help. And finally, never, ever hurt yourself as a way to get relief. Many, many people, and I'm pretty sure there are many of you out there who at least know someone who has sought to hurt themselves, for example, by cutting themselves as a way to release intense and distressing emotions. Definitely, that is not going to help you. And so the moment you find yourself going down that route, that's a signal. You've got to immediately seek help from a friend, a family member, or perhaps a professional.
This has been fantastic. We have it's been so interesting seeing the questions coming in on Slido, because people, it's obviously something where people don't feel comfortable talking about this in a lot of situations and are really keen to. So the questions we're getting in have been fascinating. The commentary between the questions has been fascinating. So I really appreciate the chance to have this conversation with you today and to share all these insights. It's been really, really impactful. I want to share the question that sort of has been the most bolstered on Slido. When people share a question, people can pick that question and really want it to be shared. So here it is on our screen. How can I speak to and help someone with a mental health problem? So if we have students today or people that are want to talk to someone in their lives with a mental health problem, how would you recommend that they go about that?
What a great, you guys are asking me such great questions. Thank you. Well, there is no magic formula for this. It's simply being aware. The fact that you ask this question signals that you know that sometimes someone you're with is having a bad day or having a bad week. The most important thing to do is not to simply wish it away and walk away. The most important thing to do is to actually ask, hey, Peter, is something the matter? Why are you losing your shirt with me? Hey, Donna, why are you looking so glum? Ask. Because by asking your close friends or your family members, when you feel that something is wrong, that is the best way. It's not, like I said, there's no magic words. Just say, hey, what's wrong? Because it's okay to ask and it's okay not to be okay.
Excellent. Thank you so much again. And thanks for all our students for sharing that question, for wanting it to be asked today. What I want to do is take 2 more because we have time for them, and then we'll wrap up from there. So our next big question, which I'll also bring into the screen for you, is one that I know that a lot of my own personal friends, family have talked about in the past, and there's a real stigma associated with this at times. And so, what is your opinion on taking medication to help your mental health?
So, you know what? I think that the mental health is, as I mentioned earlier, very diverse. You remember? I talked about the dimension. That's quite different from, say, for example, infection. With infection, everyone with the infection gets a treatment. With mental health problems, Not everyone gets the same kind of treatment, because first of all, there are many different kinds of mental health problems, but also each kind of mental health problem can be anywhere along that dimension. So medication is extremely helpful for certain types of mental health problems, both in terms of the nature of those mental health problems as well as the severity of those mental health problems. There is no one size fits all in mental health care. If you need medication and you have seen a doctor who has advised it, then that is a good suggestion for you. But the flip side is, every mental health problem does not need a medication. In fact, in my reckoning, the vast majority of the mental health problems will recover with psychological and social interventions. A minority will need drugs, and they should get those drugs. But it should never be seen as an either-or.
I'm really glad we got a chance to share that question today, and I figured it would be one of the first ones we got. So thank you so much to our students for sharing that on Slido. We're going to take one more question from Rayleigh in North Carolina. She's been joining us for all sorts of programs in the last 2 weeks. So she wants to know about loneliness. Do we think because of the pandemic we'll understand more about how loneliness affects us? If you can speak to this. And then she segues it into space missions, where people are going to be with a few people or alone for long periods of time, and how that might affect them.
Yeah, well, you know what? Let me take the example of the astronaut. The astronauts have chosen to go into space. They have been trained, prepared for years for those periods of loneliness. You and I haven't had any choice, nor have we had any preparation for what's happened to us in the last 8 or 9 months. And therefore, it's really important for us to make every effort to consciously acknowledge that this loneliness that we experience right now is a passing phase. And as I mentioned earlier, always to be hopeful and knowing that this is going to end. And I want to emphasize that right now. We have 3 vaccine candidates already on the horizon. This thing will pass. But while we wait for it to pass, I believe that one of the biggest errors we made at the start of this pandemic is to call for social distancing. It was the wrong word. It should have been physical distancing. You do not get the infection by being socially connected to someone. You get the infection if you're sitting too close to them. But sitting close to them is different from actually meeting them, either remotely or in a park, or actually just meeting them in a ventilated place, sitting about 6 feet apart. I think if we had nuanced our public health recommendations a little bit more cleverly, we would not have landed up in the situation where we're now, where a lot of people are also fatigued by some of the demands that are being placed on us. It's a lot easier for me to say, hey, listen, when you meet someone, try and do it outdoors. And if the weather is lousy, then when you're doing it indoors, just do it in groups of 2 or 3 and sit far apart from each other and wear a mask. It's a lot easier for me to say that and say, rather than say, don't meet anyone. And that was a wrong advice. And I want you to understand that it is perfectly safe to have social contact as long as you're doing it in a way that is safe from a transmission of the infection perspective. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Jesse, for organizing this terrific event. It's such fun to be with all of you this today. I have to tell you, by the way, Jesse, I'm not in Boston. I'm actually in India. I got here about a week ago because I have a large program of work here. So actually, it's late in the evening here, but it's been fantastic to actually connect with all of you in Canada. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and welcome all the way from India. I really appreciate you joining us. I do want to mention for all our students, again, get out there, follow up with this broadcast, learn about mindfulness meditation, check out some resources near you. There's more mental health resources than ever. Bell in Canada does a lot of work on that, which is really, really exciting now. You can find more on Dr. Patel on his webpage at Harvard below. And I'd really encourage you all to check out the Gairdner Foundation and Gairdner Awards. This is our big series highlighting biomedical and global health research. So Dr. Patel, thank you so much. Over 100 kids tuning in from across Canada and the US. We really appreciate your time and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Keep up the fantastic work and see you later.
Thank you all.